If your great-grandmother was called an orphan in 1890, the first question isn't where she slept. It's who decided her family didn't count. Because in the United States, the word orphan often meant something else. Poor, immigrant, stigmatized, or simply powerless. It was a label that sounded compassionate and worked like a legal lever. The scale is easy to miss until you put real counts next to the euphemisms. In the early 1900s, the federal government was already tallying children held in institutions, orphans' homes, juvenile facilities, and other dependent systems, tens of thousands at a time. The 1,904 federal institutional census work shows how thoroughly childhood could be administered, like a category in a ledger, rather than a life in a family. Cite turn 0, search 1. And here is the point that turns the stomach. In many places, most of those children were not parentless. They were separated. They had mothers, fathers, cousins, grandparents, people who could name them, miss them, search for them. That pattern shows up again and again in local studies and archival summaries. In New Orleans, for example, historian Priscilla Ferguson Clement found that by 1915, only 15% of children registered with the city's Board of Prisons and Asylums were recorded as full orphans. Cite turn 0 search 9. That is not an orphan crisis. That is a family poverty crisis, reframed as child rescue. Once you accept that, the institutions read differently. The intake logs don't just record need. They record how an era decided which adults were fit and which children were salvageable. The Street, Louis Protestant Orphans Asylum, kept admission and departure documentation and other operational records in a way that still survives in repositories today. Cite turn 1 search 2 turn 1 search 5. Those kinds of ledgers are brutal in their calmness. Name, age, circumstance, transfer. A story flattened into columns. Then comes the machinery that made separation permanent. In New York, the juvenile asylum began as a place to warehouse truant, or disobedient children, and to receive children whose parents were in a temporary freefall. But within a few years it was doing something else, exporting children. In 1854 it partnered with the Children's Aid Society's broader Placing Out vision, and trains began carrying children away from the city, westward, to be bound out. Cite turn 0 search 14, turn 0 search 10. This is where the comforting story, charity, opportunity, fresh air starts to wobble. Indenture wasn't a metaphor. It was paperwork. Boys could be bound until 21, girls until 18, and the arrangement could be treated as a labor contract, not a family tie. Scholarship on the New York Juvenile Asylum's orphan trains describes nearly 7,000 children being loaded onto trains and indentured in Illinois during the years 1854 to 1906, a scale that makes temporary care sound like a cover story. Cite turn 0 search 14 turn 0 search 2. Other institutional summaries and compiled rosters describe more than 6,600 children indentured from this system, largely into Illinois and nearby states. Cite a turn 0 search 6me. Now picture the parent's side of that transaction. You are broke after a death, a layoff, a winter of illness. You sign papers because the city has no safety net that keeps a family intact. You are told your child will eat, learn, and come home when you can stand again. Then months later, your child is not in the building. Your child is a name that has moved from one ledger to another. Your child is a train destination you were never told. People argue back with a familiar shrug. It was a hard century. Tenements were crowded. Disease killed quickly. Maybe any shelter was better than none. So let's concede the crisis and then look at the selection. If this was purely about poverty relief, the pipeline would have been messy and random. It wasn't. It followed lines of religion, ethnicity, and race with a precision that feels like policy even when it is disguised as compassion. The orphan train movement is often described as a supervised welfare program transporting children from eastern cities to foster placements in the Midwest between 1,854 and 1,929, relocating roughly 200,000 children. Cited turn 0 search 7. But foster placement can hide everything that matters. Whose children? To whose homes? Under what assumptions about what kind of family counts as a cure? Charles Loring Brace, the Children's Aid Society's driving force, saw Protestant rural households as morally preferable to the Catholic immigrant city. That moral hierarchy did not just color the work, it structured it. That is why the backlash was immediate. Catholic leaders did not accuse Brace of conversion as a hobby. They accused him because the pattern was visible on the ground. Irish Catholic children flowing into Protestant homes, sometimes far from any community that could help them return. The public fight over religion wasn't a side drama. It was an argument about who had the right to shape a child's identity. And so Catholic institutions expanded part rescue, part defense. By the early 20th century, Catholic orphanages were a parallel system built to keep Catholic children from being placed out into Protestant homes. In practice, those institutions could reproduce the same logic of control they claimed to resist. Regimented labor, surveillance, the substitution of institutional order for family life. The goal was different, but the tool was similar. The Jewish story echoes with its own twist. In Cleveland, a Jewish orphan asylum that began with genuine war loss relief could become, over time, an Americanization engine for Eastern European immigrant children. The issue was not only whether parents lived, but whether they were regarded as culturally competent. Language, religious practice, accent, poverty, these could be treated as defects to correct, and the institution could congratulate itself by measuring how thoroughly it had loosened children from old world identity. If this sounds like I'm stitching together unrelated histories, look at what happened after emancipation. Across parts of the post-Civil War South, white authorities used apprenticeship law and orphans courts to bind black children to labor, sometimes to their former enslavers. The justification was always incapable parents. The reality was a labor regime seeking continuity after slavery's legal end. It is the same underlying move. Declare a family unfit, seize the child, turn care into contract. Then the boarding schools. By the late 19th century and into the 20th, Native children were removed and sent to institutions designed explicitly to erase language, religion, and kinship, an aim stated openly by reformers like Richard Henry Pratt and enforced through policies that tied compliance to rations and coercion. The before and after photographs from places like Carlisle exist not as evidence of care, but as propaganda of transformation. And in the archives, that transformation often meant records that break. Names replaced, spellings altered, origins simplified into a line on a form. So who were the not orphans inside orphanages? On social platforms today, Genealogy, TikToks, adoptee and foster care forums, Facebook groups of descendants, Reddit threads where people compare DNA surprises, the answer repeats with painful consistency. They were the children of widows without wages, of fathers swallowed by injury or unemployment, of immigrants navigating a hostile city in a language they didn't speak, of families targeted by moral panic about degeneracy, truancy, or vice. They were kids whose parents were alive but judged by a magistrate, a charity board, a pastor, a matron, a reformer, with a clipboard and a theory. That online chorus matters because it exposes the emotional afterlife of the paperwork. People describe the same wall in their family trees. A child appears in a census as inmate in an institution, then later appears under a different surname in a different state. They describe discovering, through DNA matching, that a family legend about adoption was really a coerced placement. They trade tips on where to request sealed files, how to write an archive, how to find an intake ledger entry that might list a mother's name before it disappears. What the platforms are doing, sometimes clumsily, sometimes brilliantly, is reconstructing kinship that the system made hard to reconstruct. It also changes how you read official reform. In January 1909, Theodore Roosevelt convened the White House Conference on the Care of Dependent Children. The conference became a landmark in U.S. social welfare history, and historians note that its recommendations helped set guidelines for child care and influenced the later creation of the U.S. Children's Bureau. Site Turn 1 Search, 3 Turn 1 Search 4. The conference's logic is striking. It treated the family home as the best environment and warned against breaking homes apart for poverty alone. In other words, the experts looked at the same system and admitted quietly that it had been doing something it should not do. But acknowledgement is not repair. The machine could be wound down without unbinding the children already shipped out, without creating a national registry for reconnection, without resourcing reunification. Records remain scattered across archives and institutions, many closed for privacy or lost through neglect. Columbia University, for example, holds a major collection of New York juvenile asylum ledgers and operational records, proof that the paper trail exists, even if access is complicated. Site turn 0, search 10. The evidence is present, but it is not arranged for families. It is arranged for institutions. The result is a particular kind of historical silence, not the absence of documents, but the absence of bridges between documents. In online communities, people call it genealogy amnesia. They describe it as grief without a funeral, knowing someone existed, knowing they were taken, and having nowhere to place the pain. When a last known writer dies, news stories still surface because it feels like a door closing on living memory. Site turn 0, search 3. So why did children really lose their children? Sometimes it was surrender under duress, a parent believing in temporary care. Sometimes it was court commitment for incorrigibility that translated poverty into delinquency. Sometimes it was religious power, rescuing children from the wrong faith by relocating them into the right one. Sometimes it was labor economics, farms and households needing hands and being offered children as placements. Sometimes it was outright racial control, apprenticeship and boarding schools working as extensions of domination. The connecting thread is that poverty and identity were treated not as conditions to support, but as reasons to separate. And what happened to the families left behind? They waited. They wrote letters that were never delivered or were censored. They traveled back to institutions that told them the child was placed. They were instructed to be grateful. In today's terms, they were gaslit by benevolence. The system called itself charity, and that word did two jobs at once. It soothed the public, and it stripped parents of moral standing. If the removal was charity, then the parent had to be a problem. That is why the number most children institutionalized not being full orphans matters so much. It isn't just a statistic. It is a map of how an entire society decided that some families were disposable. It explains why the paper goes blank right where the pain begins. Because paperwork was designed to serve placement, not memory. Children admitted under one name could be placed out under another. A ledger could record an origin and then, in the next line, erase it with a destination. If you have a family tree that freezes in the late 19th century, don't assume the fire burned your records or the courthouse lost them. Consider a more unsettling possibility. Your family's link was severed by policy, by a pipeline, by a bureaucracy that made children portable and parents silent. The evidence isn't mystical. It is in ledgers, in court petitions, in boarding school rosters, in adoption registries, in archival collections that sit untouched because they are hard to access and harder to read. The question, then, isn't whether the system helped any child. Some children did find safer homes. Some did gain stability. The question is why help was engineered to require disappearance. Why did rescue so often mean relocation without consent, identity without continuity, and childhood repurposed as labor or conversion? That design choice repeated across Protestant placing out programs, immigrant Americanization institutions, post-emancipation apprenticeship schemes, and native boarding schools did not happen by accident. It happened because a society wanted children and did not want the inconvenient families attached to them. And the last piece is the hardest. Even now, there has been no broad, official accounting that matches the scale of the harm. No unified public index of placements. No systematic reunification support for descendants trying to reconnect names. Instead, people do what they have always done when institutions refuse. They build their own networks. They compare records, trade archive tips, and use DNA to stitch together what paper tried to cut apart. Social platforms have become, in an ironic reversal, the first mass system designed not to place children out, but to bring families back into focus. If we insist on calling the old system charity, we should be honest about what kind. It was a charity that measured success by throughput, by transformation, by compliance, by the clean lines of a record book. A charity that could look at a child with living parents and still decide, this child is easier to move than this family is to support. And once you see that logic, you start to recognize it everywhere, not just in history, but in the way paperwork can still outrun human ties whenever poverty is treated as a moral failing rather than a condition to remedy.